Welcome to Stories from the Village of Nothing Much. Like easy listening, but for fiction. I'm Kathryn Nicolai. I write and read all the stories you'll hear on the Village of Nothing Much. Audio engineering and sound design is by Bob Wittersheim. In our show notes, you'll find links to our ad-free premium version, our other shows, and some lovely, cozy merch. Storytelling is medicine, but it's like yummy medicine. It's like my Flintstones chewables when I was 6. I wanted to eat the whole bottle. But seriously, stories help us step outside of our thoughts, expand our perspectives, and maybe even feel good. That's my goal with the kind of stories I write. I want to help you feel good. I think it's important. In fact, hang on, if no one has told you in a bit, allow me to have the honor. It matters that you enjoy your life. Your happiness is important, a priority. So I'll tell you some stories from this sweet little village we can disappear into for a bit. You relax. Maybe imagine yourself there, surrounded by the comforts of this world. And if you make it to the end, I'll share some behind-the-scenes details. Now, let's take a deep breath in through the nose and sigh from your mouth. Nice. Do that one more time. Breathe in and let it out. Good. Our stories today are about some of the joys of midwinter. We'll start by layering up the bed to keep the chill out in winter quilt. Then we'll step out into the fresh air and listen to some birdsong as icicles drip in winter views. Finally, we'll let one good turn lead to another in a story about snowy sidewalks and grocery sacks called Pass It On. The Winter Quilt. I have a lovely comforter. So soft and fluffy, and it is truly comforting. Diving into bed at the end of a long day, pulling it around me and tucking in the edges is so soothing and snuggly. But in January, when the bitter cold begins to creep in through the old wood floors, when the biting winds rattle the window panes and frost spreads over their surface, that fluffy comforter just won't do. That's when I go to the linen closet and take down the heavy winter quilt that has been warming my bed for most of my life. It was stitched by a neighbor who babysat for me when I was a child. I remember her living room, full of old pictures in old frames. Figurines that I was afraid I would knock to the ground even when I was trying very hard not to touch them. And a candy dish that, while full, never held the kind of candy I was interested in. Thinking back, I probably drove her up the wall a bit. I was noisy and easily got the zoomies. I wanted sandwiches cut the way my dad made them, and I never wanted to take a nap. But still, she made me this beautiful quilt. It must have taken many hours. It easily spread over a king-size bed and was full of designs and artistry. Pulling it down from the closet, I let out an oof when it dropped down into my arms. It is heavy, a weighted blanket before anyone was hip to the idea. I store it in a zippered bag to keep dust and moths away, and I set it on my bed to open it up. This quilt is like a long, epic book. Every time you read it, you notice a detail, a line, a scrap of story that you never had before. As I shook it out and began to spread it over the bed, my eyes landed on shapes and colors that I swear hadn't been there the winter before. The background was a creamy white, and many of the patches were sewn in with a deep blue thread. There was a general color scheme of chestnut brown and emerald green that made me think of the trees in the park across the street from the house I'd grown up in. But that brown shade, It also matched my hair, which, when I had been a child, babysat by this kind woman, was long and wild, usually starting off in a braid or pigtails, but quickly coming down in my play till it hung in my eyes. In another square of the quilt, I recognized some shapes that hinted at a bicycle, and I remembered riding in front of her house, my mom's hand on the seat as I wobbled and ran onto the grass. It was a neighborhood with small homes and old trees, and her house sat on a corner. Every kid on a bike cut that corner, which for a while she'd tried to protect with a bit of fencing and flowers, but eventually gave up. And when all the grass had been worn away by 100 bike tires, she pushed pretty stones into the dirt. And I remember squatting down and running my fingers over them, marveling at the shimmer and colors. I used all my strength to pick up the quilt and toss it over the length of the bed. And as I smoothed it and straightened it into place, I spotted a little bird sewn into the design. It was small, only as big around as a soup spoon, and I thought it might be a sparrow. It was one of those small details that I somehow had never seen before. And I noticed at its feet were tiny specks of brown thread, birdseed to sustain it. She had had a bird bath in her backyard, one that we watched from the kitchen window. It was an old cast iron piece, probably weighed 100 pounds, and I wondered if it was still there. Perhaps it had been too difficult to move and was just passed down from owner to owner each time the house sold. I think she may have called me Sparrow. It rang a bell. I think it might have been her pet name for me, because of how I flitted around, flew from game to game. And here she had sewn me into my quilt. I rested my hand on the little stitched bird and felt a swell of affection for the maker. I realized I didn't even know her first name. She had always been a Mrs. to me, and still I thought of her that way. The whole time I'd been bringing out the quilt and laying it on the bed, the cold had been making its way up through my sock-covered feet. And while I wanted to keep admiring the handiwork and the memories that came with it, there was a pervasive chill in my body, and I couldn't wait to get into bed. I shivered over to the windows and looked out as I lowered the blinds. On the street, snow was coming down as it had been all day, and the wind was blowing. A car in the distance was moving very slowly. Masses of snowflakes lit up in its headlights, and I sent a little wish for them to make it to their own warm bed safely and soon. Then I pulled back the quilt and sheet and slid into bed. Whew, those sheets were cold, and I lay very still for a while, letting my body heat warm them. I reached for the quilt and pulled it up to my chin, then tucked my arms back underneath it. The weight of it made me drowsy immediately, and I reached one arm back into the cold air to pull the chain on my bedside lamp. In the dark, I felt my breath slowing down. I watched the flickers of light through my blinds as cars passed by, and I knew I was moments from sleep. The quilt was pressing me into the mattress, and I made one little shift to be a tad more comfortable, feeling that this night's sleep would be one in which I barely moved at all. Then all my muscles relaxed, and though the tip of my nose was chilled, the rest of me was warm under the thick covers. As I drifted, I thought about my neighbor once more. She had only known me as a child, and I had only known her in the last years of her life. My dreamy mind wondered if we could somehow meet each other in the middle. Me older, her younger. Could we sit down and have a cup of coffee and tell each other about our lives? Would we recognize each other? Could she show me more of the hidden stories sewn into the quilt? In a dream, perhaps. Winter views. Winter isn't just one thing, one feeling, one temperature, one scent. And that was something I always forgot from the distance of July. If I thought of it then, all I could come up with was bitter cold, a memory of icy air stinging my nostrils, one shade of white coating everything. And so when I was actually here, moving through midwinter, it was always a sweet surprise when the morning air didn't sting, but instead made me feel awake and alive. I gulped it down in deep, greedy breaths, just as I had the scent of lilacs in the spring or summer tomato vines. Yes, the light was sometimes gray, the days shorter, but there is something special that happens at sunset in the winter that is uplifting and affirming right when you need it most. As the sun drops in the sky, right before it sets fully, it dips below the cloudy haze that blocked it for much of the day, and the sky actually gets brighter for a wonderful half hour or so. The orange light cuts through windows. It will find you where you sit, with your cheek propped in your hand, listless from the winter monotony, and dazzle you, make you sit up straight and come to the window and look out. You might even put on your coat and boots and step outside and let it shine on your face for a minute or so. And as long as you're out there, why not take a brisk walk around the block? Flush your lungs out and fill yourself up with fresh air. These are the bits of winter I forgot about through the rest of the year that made me so glad to be in this season as it progressed. The snow had melted for a few days, and the sidewalks had run with water, the hard ground not able to keep up with how fast things had changed. That first day out, my boots had gotten muddy and sodden, though I'd barely noticed. I was looking up, spotting nests and abandoned hives in the treetops. A cardinal sat chirping in the branches, and I laughed, wondering if he ever looked down at us and sang out, "Oh, a human." Fair enough. Few of us could sing like he did. In another day or so, the pavement had dried up, and everyone was out taking advantage of the break in the weather. Dogs in sweaters, children on the bikes they'd gotten for Christmas or Hanukkah. And I felt that this too was something I forgot about when I thought of winter. It breeds a sort of fellowship. We were all feeling the same things as we waved from different sides of the street. We all tipped our faces up to the sun and sighed with the relief of it. We'd gained about 30 minutes of daylight since the solstice, and it felt like such a gift at the end of the day. It gave me a bit of a lift just to be able to see out to the pines at the back of my yard for a little longer each day. I often felt that as soon as the sun went down, well, so did I. It made me rush through dinner and often had me yawning and blinking by 7. Now, just to have a little extra time, it inspired me. I slowed down. I thumbed through a cookbook, or watered my plants, or brewed a cup of tea and sipped it from the sofa. Our bodies have clockwork tuned up to the seasons and sun, don't they? Those early nights to bed had been needed. The weeks of doing less were restorative. And now things were turning, subtly and slowly but surely. And I thought about what I might do with the bit of winter that remained. It wasn't done snowing, that was for sure. These breaks in the weather came and went, and we still had plenty of snow days left. There was a skating rink downtown, and I thought it must be absolutely beautiful to skate in the warmth of late afternoon, to stay on the ice as the twinkle lights come on, and then go somewhere for a hot cocoa after your legs were tired out. And there was a film festival at the movie theater. I'd seen it advertised in the paper. On one screen they were showing the full filmography of some director whose work had been mostly ignored at the time, but seemed prescient and current, and now was appreciated. On another screen there were short films, some comic and some serious. And in this category there were even a few local entries. It was a way I'd never spent a Saturday, all day at the theater, voting on films, seeing things I knew nothing about beforehand. Well, Well, maybe that was what made it an excellent idea. There were also seeds to start. Packs of them had come in the mail the week before, and the garden club, of which I'd become a member last spring, had sent out a newsletter with instructions for making starting pots from recycled newspaper. I could see myself clearing off the counters and rolling up my sleeves. I'd make a bit of a mess, and it would no doubt take longer than I anticipated, but eventually all my little seeds would be tucked into their soil beds and waiting to sprout under the lamps. This year I was growing dahlias, and nothing else, just dahlias. But I would crack their code and grow the biggest double blooms the neighborhood had ever seen. What else? What else could I look forward to this winter? I'd been gifted a membership in the Jam of the Month Club and thought I could make some thumbprint cookies with the first jar that had come. It was deep purple, huckleberry, and I bet they would go perfectly with a cup of coffee in the morning. Puzzles and old movies, a hike up the crow's nest path in the snow, watching the sun come up a little earlier each morning. Paper whites budding on the sill. Winter came with so many gifts, 100 different views over the horizon. It wasn't one thing, it was many. Pass it along. At the end of last year, just before Christmas, I'd been sitting in my office watching the snow come down thick and fast. It had been a nice feeling to see downtown lit up and bustling below me, folks walking through the snow, the shops busy as customers did their shopping. And as the afternoon wore on and the flakes kept falling, I noticed the cars on the street with several inches of fresh snow on their windshields. I'd grimaced, remembering that my old scraper had snapped in two the last time I'd used it. I'd tossed it in the garbage can, saying to myself, now don't forget to pick up a new one or you'll be in trouble next time it snows. Had I remembered? Had that note to self stuck in my mind? No, not until the exact moment when I looked down at the street. Oh man, I started to strategize. Surely I could borrow one. The office was nearly deserted, though, so close to the holiday, and I walked through the halls looking for someone to appeal to. I stuck my head into the break room and spotted my colleague filling his teacup at the kettle. Do you have a scraper in your car? I do, he said, and I sighed in relief. But, he went on, and I have a feeling that this detail is pertinent. I lent my car to my mom for the day. I'm walking. I chuckled, as that detail was indeed pertinent. Right, well, if I can get my car dug out of the snow, do you want to ride home? It's really coming down out there. We both looked out through the windows, me with a bit of nervousness for my now nearly covered car, and him with excitement. No thanks. I wore my boots, and I'm kind of looking forward to it. I like getting all bundled up and trekking home. Well, let me know if you change your mind, I said as I headed back into the hall, this time making my way to the broom closet. If worse came to worse, I figured I could use the little whisk broom we had in there to brush off the snow. The ice would eventually melt if I had my defroster up to high. It would take some time, but I could do it. I had another half hour of work to take care of, and I leaned the broom against my desk and went back to closing the loops on any unfinished business. We'd be off for a couple of weeks, and it felt satisfying to tidy up my desk, file away the last few papers, and finally close my calendar for the year. The light was dimming outside as I started to layer on my coat and hat, my gloves and scarf. I found my colleague in the hall tying up his boots, excited to start out on his walk home, and we took the elevator down together. More folks joined us as we crept toward ground level, and that giddy feeling of closing up for the holidays was tangible. We all wished each other a good break as we stepped out onto the street. I turned toward my car, clutching the broom, expecting to find just a car-shaped mound of white, but instead saw that it had been dug out. completely cleaned off, the windshield scraped free of ice. And so was the car next to it, and the one after that, and so on down the block. A half dozen or so of us had been given this gift, and I looked up and down the street trying to see who had done the giving. A man across the street was standing ankle-deep in the snow, shoveling around the tires of a nearly buried car, and I called out to him. He was wrapped up tight in a scarf that covered almost all of his face, dusted all over with snow. But I could see, even from across the street, the brightness of his eyes. He seemed lit up from what he was doing. "Thank you. I forgot my scraper today. I would have been here all night." "Then I picked the right car," he called back. Traffic passed slowly between us, and I felt like I owed him something more. Saying thank you didn't quite feel like enough. I started and stopped, not sure what to say. He waved his hand at me, seeming to understand what I felt. Then he pulled down his scarf so I could see him clearly. "Just pass it along. Someone passed it to me, that's all. Just don't let it drop." I smiled and nodded and headed back to the car. A good deed for good deed's sake? Challenge accepted. I could do that. That night I'd driven slowly home through the snow and stopped at a gas station to buy not one, but 2 scrapers. That way I'd have a spare in case I came across someone else who needed one. That felt like a good start on my mission, but what if I didn't find another scraperless soul for a bit? I needed to find something more impactful to do. And that brings me to today. I'd been keeping my ears and eyes open, looking for some need that I could fill. And while I'd returned my shopping cart to the grocery store and picked up some trash in the parking lot, I still felt that I hadn't quite passed it along. That favor was stuck in my pocket, and it was starting to wear through the seams. I'd been peering out my front window, watching a cardinal on a branch in the rowan tree, when a delivery van came trundling down the road. It stopped at the house kitty corner to mine, and the driver got out and started carrying bags up to the front porch. I remembered hearing that this particular neighbor had taken a bad spill a few days back while ice skating. She'd sprained her ankle and would be on crutches for a week or 2. As the delivery van drove away, looking down at the bags of groceries with a stumped look on her face. Finally, it was my time to shine. I slipped into my boots and went through the front door, calling to her as I paused to look both ways. The relief on her face as she spotted me reminded me of my own when I'd found my car shoveled out and scraped. This was the gift, getting to give someone that feeling that they aren't alone and that others are willing to help. She shuffled back as I slipped in with the bags and didn't protest when I offered to put her groceries away. I made her a cup of tea while I was at it, took out the garbage, and carried a pail of scraps to her compost bin in the backyard. When I handed her the cup, as she sat on the couch with her ankle propped on a pillow, she started to thank me. And I said, "Just pass it along." I am writing this on a sunny winter morning in Michigan, but it is very cold. A literal, breathtaking 10 degrees. I live in a house that turns 100 this year, and the floorboards this morning were a little shocking. It made me wish I had a thick quilt to add to my bed. That first story was inspired by a note I got from a listener years ago. I'm afraid I don't remember their name. But they wrote me a beautiful letter about a memory of being tucked into bed at their grandparents' house under a heavy handmade quilt while thunder and lightning boomed and flashed outside. It became a little dog-eared page in my mind, and like 5 years later, it found its way into a story. And this story made me think about my own grandmother, although the character of the quilt maker is not based on her. It was based instead on a lovely lady who watched me a few times as a little girl. Her name was Mrs. Goss, and I don't have many memories of her. I think what I have are the fond remembrances of my mother, who was grateful to have some help when she had 2 little kids and was working on her master's degree. Funny how kindness ripples, which I guess is the theme of these 3 episodes. Even when you don't catch the full force of an act of kindness, it has a way of rippling out to touch a lot of people. Back to my grandma. I have a joke I tell about her. I actually might tell several about her, but this one rings true to me as I look at these stories. And that is that my relationship with my grandmother has vastly improved since she died. Please know that I say that with so much love. My grandmother and I pushed each other's buttons like it was our job. And now that she has passed, I look back at her with so much more understanding and compassion. She was someone who was afraid of nearly everything, and in rebellion, I decided to be afraid of nothing. She was afraid for me to go to the corner alone, so I moved to Italy when I was 16. I sure showed her. Now, with more life experience and wisdom, I think she probably really suffered with especially social anxiety, but probably generalized anxiety as well. And now I get that. So I guess I'm just saying this to remind you that relationships don't end when someone passes. They can keep developing and acquire new levels of love and understanding. Oh, Grandma. I wonder what she would think of me now. The second episode today, Winter Views, was inspired by a walk I took one day that gave me a big boost in the middle of cold, dark days. Suddenly, the sun was out, and the air smelled sweet again, and I thought, hey, I can keep going. And I realized I write a similar episode most winters. It's part of the cycle of the season, I guess. I just wrote this year's yesterday, and it will come out in a few days on Nothing Much Happens. It's called Sunny Skies. Finally, we heard Pass It On today, and this story connects to the Tree Farm story, episode 53, if you want to go back. The man who was gifted his Christmas tree a few days before the holiday has passed that kindness on by clearing off snow-covered cars. I used to own a yoga studio, and this would be a yearly project for the community. We would see how many acts of kindness we could contribute to for a month. And people often tried for really big acts, things that felt overt, but I want to remind you that sometimes it is the very small ones that resonate the most. A welcoming smile, a little patience, a little consideration, they can go very, very far and can contribute to an overall ethos of kindness. We are starting the same community project now on our Nothing Much Happens social feeds. So if you'd like to follow us on Instagram, Blue Sky, or TikTok, if that still exists, join us. And we'll share small things that we can do to make the world a little softer. And I do want to say, though, that kind is different than nice. And while it is a laudable goal to always be kind, I don't think it is to always be nice. When we're told to be nice, it usually means swallow that bad treatment and don't say anything about it. And nope, you don't have to. Or it could mean stop standing up for yourself and let me walk all over you. Nope. I remember asking one of my meditation teachers about this once. What was I meant to do when I saw harm in the world? Sit more meditation? Think of peace? He said, no, get in there and shelter the harmed, but have compassion for everyone. He said that those who hurt others are poisoning themselves with the strongest dose of that poison, that they might never wake up to why they were so miserable. And most days, I can do that. Oh, one last note. When this last story came out on Nothing Much Happens, I got a few messages from folks who thought an office building tall enough to have an elevator that stopped on multiple floors before it got to the bottom floor was not village material. Where is this building? And I just today realized why it didn't strike me at all as odd when I wrote it. It's because I am from Flint, Michigan, a city that built big, tall buildings and then shrank a bunch. And when I was delivering sandwiches in downtown, my college job, it felt like a small village with just a few open storefronts among a sea of very tall buildings. By the way, Flint is still beautiful, and I am very proud to be from there. Talk about a place where kindness ripples. Thank you so much for spending some time with me in the village of nothing much today. I wish you a week of ripples, of sunlight, sparrows, and snow.